I've brought it to 314 Reactor here. Today we are continuing our journey through 3DMark, and now we have reached 3DMark11, which was released on December 7th, 2010 and makes extensive use of DirectX 11. So here we are on the white paper, as we always do. Let's scroll past some of the preamble. There's some information on preset configurations here. We're not going to worry about that too much because we're going to be running in 4K on an RTX 4090 with a Ryzen 7700X, so the specs are well beyond this, so we'll be well beyond even extreme. Let's have a look at the rendering engine. So by this point in 2010, multi-core CPUs were pretty much default in any PC you would buy, so the rendering engine has become much more focused on multiple threading, and it spreads the rendering workload across these multiple threads and physical CPU cores using the new DirectX 11 device context and command lists, which means the GPU is getting fed more information so it can be much more efficient, and the CPU is less of a bottleneck when rendering more complex scenes. And there's also hardware tessellation that's been introduced into Direct 3D at this point. I think tessellation had been done before with TruForm a few years back on ATI cards. I don't think that was universally implemented. This has now been implemented on the API level so that any cards with a compatible shader model and DirectX support can use tessellation. So tessellation in computer graphics and rendering is a case of taking polygons and subdividing them up into more polygons based on a set of parameters. So you can see here, you can take a cube and you can tessellate it down into more polygons to make a sphere. And then you can add your pixel shaders and various other things to the final product, because essentially when you're using parallax mapping and bumps mapping, it's adding surface detail, but it's not actually adding any actual geometry detail to it, so the silhouette remains the same. So this actually modifies the actual geometry of the objects in 3D space, and it's all controlled by a tessellation control shader. Like I said, ATI TruForm existed back in the day, which is where you could do the tessellation on the actual hardware, but it was only available on the Radeon series on ATI, and then support for hardware tessellation only became mandatory in DirectX 11 and OpenGL 4, and tessellation as defined in those APIs is only supported by the newer TerraScale 2, which is an evolution of TruForm that was introduced in September 2009. So the actual technology on ATI or AMD cards now is now called the geometric processor. On graphics card next architectures, which is AMD graphics cards as a geometric processor, and that's what is used by Direct3D 11 and OpenGL for tessellation. So I imagine before it would have been a very game specific and a very hardware specific thing with ATI, because now it's defined in the API layer, it just has to have the hardware be compatible with it. It's kind of like ray tracing, where the majority of GPUs, as long as they're compatible with Vulkan RT and DirectX ray tracing, they can pretty much support any game that supports those APIs rather than having to be vendor specific. So it's really cool to see this be introduced. I remember when I first played Stalker Call of Pripyat and it had DirectX 11 in it. It was the first DirectX 11 game that I played, and it had tessellation in it, and it was very, very cool when I got my GTX 570 in 2012, 12 years ago almost exactly now. It had DirectX 11 support, and I was able to switch onto Direct 3D 11 in Stalker Call of Pripyat, and all of the characters' heads and stuff and gun barrels and scopes all became perfectly round because it just increased the amount of geometric detail, so you no longer had that sort of octagonal effect on circles. And I imagine that's what's evolved now into Nanite on UE5 and the virtualized geometry system. I'm going to need to do some more research into that, but I imagine the underlying technology is very similar, because you'll be essentially modifying geometry on the fly, but it's not just due to a set of parameters with Nanite, it's loading from a much higher detailed mesh and streaming it in to the game engine in real time. So that is probably something we will see as we go forward and look at the more modern 3D Mark, and it's probably something I may do a bit more of a dedicated video on, just to educate myself on it a bit more. But this is jumping a little bit ahead of things. Again, all these links will be down in the description, so you can go check those out. Let's head back to the 3DMark11 white paper. 3DMark11 uses two different types of tessellation: displacement map and Phong tessellation with optional displacement map. In detailed tessellation, vertices produced by the tessellator are positioned based on a displacement map. So yeah, the displacement map would define how the geometry is displaced. I imagine that's how UE5 works. It virtualizes the geometry, and then that is used as an instruction to tessellate the geometry in real time. In Phong tessellation, vertices are placed on an approximate curved surface before displacement. Curved surfaces approximate is computed from the positions and normals of the triangle vertices. Places the vertices. It uses a Phong shading technique to calculate the normals between a set of vertices, and then uses that to define where the tessellator will add in extra detail through subdivision. So I'll add in a link to the description about Phong shading and calculation and how that works. And I'll also add in a video from a really cool channel that I've been checking out lately that has a lot of information about graphical techniques. So the main thing to take away from it is that 3DMark11 uses a lot of tessellation, which means that in the demo you'll have seen some really cool geometry there at the start of the video, and as we go through the benchmarks we'll see even more cooler geometry and hopefully get a bit more of a detailed look at it. So the lighting system is done with deferred rendering here, so that means you can get much more complexity with the lighting, much more real-time shadowing and shading and lighting, really complex shadows. Again, something else I believe Stalker was the first or one of the first to start using with a deferred engine, so you have shadows and lighting pretty much everywhere. So yeah, it says here rendering is done as deferred style. Geometry attributes are first rendered to a set of render targets. Ambient occlusion is then computed from depth and normal buffers, and then finally illumination is rendered based on those attributes. So I think deferred renderers had been done before, and because of the way it works you couldn't do MSAA on it, but I think with DirectX 11 it allowed MSAA to work on that, so we should be able to have MSAA running on this and make it look really smooth. This is real old school stuff. Put a link in the description about MSAA and why that wouldn't work with deferred rendering. It's something I still need to get my head around as well. So yeah, there's some more information about the surface illumination here, and it also has volumetric illumination. Supports optional volume illumination. It's computed by approximating the light scattered towards the viewer by the medium between the eye and the visible surface on each lit pixel. And it's done by volume ray casting and by Rayleigh Mie Scattering attenuation model. One ray is cast on each lit pixel for each light. The cast ray is sampled at several depth levels. So it is a sort of very early form of ray tracing or more ray casting, very simplified ray usage, which gives some really cool volumetric lighting, especially in the underwater sections. At the time, brand new stuff, looked really cool long before ray tracing became a thing. Got some depth of field, bloom, lens reflections, and then there's details of the graphics test here. A scene with a large number of shadows, shadow casting and non-shadow casting spotlights, point lights, volumetric illumination. The graphics test 1 has no tessellated geometry. The graphics card test 2 does have tessellated geometry, and again it uses very similar lighting and volumetric illumination. Graphics test 3 has a scene with one shadow casting directional light and a moderate number of non-shadow casting point lights. Volumetric illumination is only enabled for the shadow casting directional light, and it contains tessellated geometry. Graphics test 4 contains very similar to 1, 2, and 3. The majority of the rendering workload comes from drawing tessellated geometry to shadow maps and G-buffer, so we should see quite a lot of tessellated geometry on that. There's a physics test with a large number of rigid bodies. The rigid bodies collide with each other and some are connected with joints, and it uses the Bullet open source physics C++ library. So I don't think this uses PhysX anymore. Imagine because PhysX was long absorbed into NVIDIA at this point. But then there's a combined test where a scene with a large number of rigid and soft bodies is simulated and rendered, and they collide with each other. The soft body simulation is computed using DirectX compute shaders. That's where PhysX probably would have been doing it previously, but now it's being done in compute shaders. So again, it's been abstracted up to the API level. The Bullet open source physics library is used as a physics SDK for this test and compiled and linked statically to the test binary at development time. The test also contains considerable graphics workload. In addition to the physics workload, it includes tessellation, volumetric illumination, and post-processing effects. So the combined test is really going to push the CPU and the GPU. And then there's just some information here about how the scores are calculated. You've got a very shortened down white paper here compared to the old ones, which are 30 odd pages. So it's a bit of a shame really, but I have got it printed out here, so we should be able to go through the tests while we are looking at the white paper. Again, this is now considered a legacy benchmark and is now available for free on the ul.com website, formerly known as FutureMark, and you can download it and get the key that'll activate it for you. I have it on Steam from where I downloaded it and purchased it a long time ago, but I don't believe it's available in the store anymore. Yes, it's not available in the Steam store anymore. So if you've already purchased it, you'll still be able to use it and run it, but if you haven't got it, you won't be able to buy it now. But again, you can download it from the ul.com website and activate it using the key there, so that's not too much of a worry. Again, all these links will be in the description. And so here we are in 3DMark11 itself, and you can see it's very slick and smooth, very much like Vantage was, but even a little bit more smoother. So you got the entry level, performance level, and extreme levels here. You got the 3DMark11 experience. They've reintroduced the demo this time, which is good, and there's also benchmark tests only, ability to display centered or stretched scaling. Go to advanced, you can select all the graphics graphics test you want to run. You can put the resolution up to anything you want. Again, scaling mode, MSA, sample count, texture filtering mode, anisotropic. You can control the level of anisotropic. You can also control the level of tessellation, max tessellation factor, shadow map size, shadow cascade count, surface shadow sample count, volumetric illumination quality, ambient occlusion quality, depth of field quality, color saturation, whether you loop it, audio on the demo, window mode, vertical sync, triple buffering, and wireframe. So you can actually chuck wireframe on and actually see the level of tessellation that's happening. So we may have a look at that at some point. There's still quite a few settings here. I think there's more settings here than there were on Vantage. So it's good to see the settings going back up. Again, you can't exactly flick between pixel shader versions like you could on 2006, 2005, and 2003. And then you've got the results page here, which you can again view at 3DMark11. And they'll automatically get uploaded and viewed on there once you've run a benchmark. And of course, there's just a generic help thing here, and you can select what graphics adapter you are running it on. So that should be on the RTX 4090. Let's dive in. What we're going to do is run through all the graphics tests, physics tests, and then the combined test. And we're going to do it all with everything absolutely maxed out. See how it runs. And while we're going through that, I'm going to have the white paper here, and I'm going to be trying to talk through it. So let's dive in. So here we are on graphics test 1, which has a large number of both shadow casting and non-shadow casting spotlights and non-shadow casting point lights. This is where volumetric illumination with noise adjusted optical density is used, and the scene contains no tessellated geometry. So you can see there's a ton of really nice post-processing going on there, lens flare, all sorts. You can see the noise adjusted optical density of the volumetric illumination there. Graphics test 2 looks like it has some tessellated geometry in it. There we go. I think that's some tessellated geometry right there. Really high detail on that underwater fauna there. And look at that. Look at all the detail. That is really cool. That very much reminds me of Crysis 3. And yeah, we're running about 30 to 40 frames a second here. So it's quite a heavy workload still. And here we go to graphics test 3, which is where you have one shadow casting directional light and a number of non-shadow casting point lights. And volumetric illumination is only enabled for the directional light. So the shadow casting uses volumetric illumination with optical density. And it contains tessellated geometry. So you can see a lot of detail there in the geometry and the shadows. This is also where HDR has really evolved to a point where the lighting model is starting to get very, very realistic and isn't just over the top, and the bloom isn't over the top, but it actually starts to look very, very real, and you get a lot of detail in the light and dark areas. Now on graphics test 4, which is where there's a shadow casting directional light and a few shadow casting spotlights, and it uses again volumetric illumination with optical density. So again, you've got a whole load of detail in the lighting and the shadows, all that shadowing technology that we've seen in Vantage and 3DMark 2006 has evolved greatly. There wasn't a lot of detail, but I imagine it's the same PCF, I believe, filtered shadows, but just much more higher sampling rates and just a lot more of them. So very, very clean. And here we go to the physics test, which is in a low resolution, because obviously it's a physics test, so you want to stress the CPU as much as possible. This is where you have the large number of rigid bodies being simulated. And now we have the combined test, which has a number of rigid and soft bodies, as well as a heavy-duty graphics workload at the same time. So again, this is using the Bullet open source physics library. There'll be a link in the description about that. So yeah, you can see all the really nice lighting, shadowing, volumetrics, post-processing, and all the physics going on as well. 25 frames a second. Wow. So that is a really quick benchmark this time. The other ones that I've run have all pretty much lasted for about 10 or so minutes on the benchmarks, maybe a little bit less, but that was really quick. A little bit disappointing. It's good that they've re-added in the demo, and it's good that they've got a lot of settings and stuff, but it's just strange that the whole benchmark itself has become so streamlined and short. I don't actually remember it being that short back when I ran it in the day, but here's the results. I have custom settings, so it's giving me a score of 0. So what I'm going to do is go to Advanced tab here, and I'm going to check Wireframe, and we're going to rerun that, see if we can see a bit more detail on what's actually going on with the tessellation. So let's dive in. So the first test, again, as it says there's no tessellation in it. I've never actually tried this on Wireframe. There you go. So you can see the submarines there and the polygons on them. Very few polygons. and it doesn't have any of the underwater fauna or details on it. So in the next test, when the tessellation's on, we should see a great deal more polygons in those submarines. Yeah, here, this is where you can really see the detail. Look at all those polygons there. In fact, just looking at the background there, it doesn't look like the submarines are being tessellated. So I believe, yeah, they're not. Also, all the tessellation is being done on this, on the rocks and the underwater fauna or flora, fauna. Not sure, whichever one it is. Leave a comment and let me know. But yeah, you can see really high detail on the geometry there. Oh wow, look at this. Look at the amount of polygons. So that just wasn't possible before this. There's so many polygons, even in wireframe mode, with the wireframes being coloured the colour of the textures. It almost doesn't even look wireframe at some points, because the detail is so high. That is crazy. And here we go again, the nighttime scene. Again, the plants don't even look wireframe. There's so much detail. It's so dense with polygon detail. The amount of polygons there is crazy. Again, having to shift all that vertices data using a model would just, yeah, be too much. It'd be just too slow. So doing it on hardware with a set of parameters to take a geometric mesh and tessellate it, so much more efficient. Can't wait to read more about how Nanite works. Oh, look at that. So much detail. And all the leaves on the trees looking really nice and curved because of all the extra detail. So yeah, that is awesome. And now what we're going to do is just run the demo, turn off wireframe, and we're just going to walk through the demo and talk about it as we go. We've seen it at the start of the video, but now I'm going to do some commentary over it. And then what we'll probably do is run a basic performance test, which is the general score that you would use for benchmarking on 3DMark11, and see what score the RTX 3090 and Ryzen 7700X get on this very, very old piece of benchmarking software. So first, over to the demo. There we go, sound effects back, proper music, demo back, good to see. Still not sure why they got rid of that on 3DMark Vantage. I guess this was very much the era of film grain, because it looks like there's a lot of film grain there. But then that could also be to do with the noise adjusted volumetrics. Really, really cool. So it's just not a 3DMark without this kind of demo on it. So again, I just don't know why Vantage got rid of it. And this looked incredible back in the day. It still looks good now, but compared to, like I said, Nanite and all the technology we have now that's evolved from this, yeah, doesn't really compare. I can't wait to read about Nanite, actually, because of course Nanite isn't something that's built into the API, I don't believe. It just uses technologies in the API to virtualize geometry and get extremely high detail. So it'll be really interesting to see how tessellation shaders, geometry shaders, and stuff like that fit into this. Ah, the old bouquet depth of field. That was a real thing of the time, DirectX 11 onwards. I remember when Crysis 2 came out, and it was their first DirectX 9, and then they released the DirectX 11 patch for it, which introduced bouquet depth of field, and it also included tessellation as well, which was really cool. Crysis 3 didn't have as much tessellation use in it, which was really disappointing. Because yeah, you had characters heads and things that should be curved looking really curved in Crysis 2, and then in Crysis 3 it was loads of back to sort of octagonal shapes, which is a shame. Look at the dense geometry, it's so good. Of course, 3 years after Crysis, so it's very much at that time. And I've just been playing some Escape from Tarkov lately as well, so it's good to see that all that technology has come forward. And you look at it back then and look at this and go, this was incredible at the time, like mind-blowing, and even Crysis was still pretty mind-blowing at the time. But now when you play modern games and you see modern games coming out, even relatively not great modern games that come out have this level of detail to it. So what was the absolute pinnacle of graphics technology is now just kind of normal. Like, you look at Grey Zone Warfare, Escape from Tarkov, the latest Ghost Recons, you know, most games have this level and beyond detail. And so much of it is abstracted away from people, you know, in the game engine and stuff like that. It's crazy how much progress has been made in graphics. That's why it's really cool to do this series of videos on 3DMark through the ages. So cool. Reminds me a bit of Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider. Again, with the lighting, it's just getting so good. And there we go, that was the demo. Again, really quick running demo. Not sure why it's so slimmed down. I guess maybe to make it more efficient for people to benchmark. I imagine actually by this point a lot of people were overclocking and wanting to get quicker results from the overclocks, so they didn't have to sit through like a 5 to 10 minute test. I guess that makes sense. But in terms of the demo, you'd think they'd make that a bit longer anyway. Never mind, we will see how long the next 3DMark demo and benchmarks last, and then at some point I'm going to get 3DMark 99 running. That's a bit more of a tricky one to get running because it has a 16-bit EXE on it. So what I'm going to do now is reset everything to performance mode, and I'm going to do the benchmark tests, and we're going to see what score we get out of the RTX 4090. So I'm not going to go through all of this. This might look a little bit stretched because it's running at a low resolution and it's in centered scaling. I forgot to put it to stretch scaling. But you can see here the difference. It's at 300 FPS on this at 720p. So it just shows how much extra rendering work needs to be done for 4K. And of course in performance mode the other settings are all cranked down a bit as well. We can see a little bit of the geometry morphing there. So there is quite a bit of difference when you're running in performance mode. Just the lighting, tessellation, resolution, and that is obviously reflected in the frame rate, which is many times higher than it was on 4K with everything maxed out. But you can tell it just doesn't look as good, not even in terms of resolution. You can just tell the rendering doesn't look as good. Oh, and you can really see the shimmering from the lack of anti-aliasing there as well. God, yeah, you can really see the difference. I think there's less sampling on the volumetrics as well. Tessellation, yeah, way lower. Wow. And here we're on the combined test. And here we are, 47,708 3DMark points. Now we can see here again, better than 99% of all results. Probably because no one really benchmarks on this anymore, so all the benchmarks from before were from many years ago. So yeah, 4K gaming PC was defined as a Core i7 4790K and a GTX 980. So this is 2014 sort of hardware, so it's going to be obviously way ahead of that. So yeah, this score means nothing essentially. It's just funny to see how high you can get the score to go on modern hardware, and of course the score is invalidated anyway because I have anti-aliasing settings set in the drivers. So I've just been doing a little bit of research into Nanite, and it uses mesh shaders, and there's some information here. Again, all links will be in the description about the different types of shaders. So you've got vertex shaders and how limited they are, and then geometry shaders, which we looked at last week, a little bit more advanced. And you've got tessellation shaders, again allowing a bit more detail on polygons and outputs. And then you have a mesh shader, which is much more flexible in terms of threading, and it's a lot more able to manipulate 3D meshes and also be a lot more able to compute many at once. There's some more detail here on PCGamer.com. UL Solutions, 3DMark, which of course just been looking at, they introduced their mesh shader feature test for 3DMark, so we'll be able to check that out when we look at the latest 3DMark. Mesh shaders were designed to be very similar to compute shaders. They tap into the fact that modern GPUs have been extremely good at massively parallel compute work, so game developers now have far more control of processing of triangles, especially regarding how and when to cull them, and it means you can use even more detailed models with lots and lots of polygons. And it's taken a while for it to appear in modern technology. It's mainly come out with DirectX 12, but also it's due to direct storage now being a thing, where in DirectX Ultimate, GPUs can now directly access data on SSDs, bypassing the CPU and system RAM, allowing for incredibly high detailed models to be loaded directly into the GPU. Of course, yeah, Nanite is the overall feature in UE5, and it uses mesh shaders. So I'm going to put this link in the description, and there's also some information here from Microsoft dev blogs. So there's a lot to take in here. This is going to take me quite a while to get my head around properly. So this is more of just, this is getting very far away from what we were looking at with 3DMark11 and Tessellation. Very, very far away from it. But I will try and get my head around this so that when we do look at the newest 3DMark and look at the mesh shader benchmark on that, I should be able to have a lot more information about it. So that was 3DMark11. Yeah, it's very, very technically impressive. It's good to see the demo back. I don't have that much nostalgia for it because I don't remember running it so much back in the day when it came out, because I was at uni at the time and had no money. I'm just a little bit disappointed in the lack of time that the benchmark and the demo runs. It's really, really quick. It sure makes this video easy, and it makes overclocking easy and testing and benchmarking easy, but it kind of loses that cool appeal that the prior benchmarks have had with 3DMark, in that it's such a short demo, short but sweet. From looking ahead at the next 3DMark, they've used it more of a platform now. So rather than 3DMark with a year at the end or a number at the end, you now just have 3DMark, and they introduce new benchmarks in that via DLC over time. So it's going to be probably spread out over a few videos when we look at 3DMark. So next week maybe 3DMark 99, and then we go on to the latest 3DMark if I can get 99 working. Anyway, that was 3DMark11. Again, like I said, we'll be looking at 3DMark 99 and the latest 3DMark at some point, so keep an eye out for those in the next couple of weeks. So subscribe for that and all sorts of other tech videos. Leave a like, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.